Well, I've read of a 65-year-old woman who, after a consultation with a young doctor, just came bolting out of that room screaming at the top of her lungs. She had met an older doctor in the hallway who knew her well. And he took her aside and he said, "What's wrong?" And he counseled her. Then that older doctor went to the younger doctor that she had seen in the room. And the older doctor said, "What is wrong with you? Mrs. Terry is 65 years old. She has 4 grown children, 7 grandchildren, and you tell her she's pregnant?" Well, the young doctor smiled and he said, "Well, hey, I'm sorry, and I know I'm new at this, but hey, it cured her hiccups, didn't it?" You know, we are thinking about the surprises of the first Christmas. The first Christmas. Michael did a great job last week introducing the series. Last Sunday, talking about Jesus' surprising parents. I was in Fort Myers. I was a youth minister there for about 8 years, and one of my students grew up. You know, who would have thought they would ever grow up? Grew up and was getting married, and so I was officiating the wedding there, and so we spent the weekend celebrating that while you all were here. And but you know, I was thinking about what Michael was teaching and what we find in God's Word. And you know, had we been choosing who Jesus' parents were, we probably wouldn't have chosen such young, such poor, such generally unimpressive teenagers to raise the Son of God. Yet, as we learned last week, there was a reason that God used them for such a monumental task. And the Christmas story is full of surprises. You know, every Christmas really is full of surprises, isn't it? Every gift that's under the tree that's wrapped, it's a surprise. Maybe you were surprised at one point when a son or a daughter showed up for the Christmas season at your place. The Christmas story that we read about in Matthew and Luke, they were anticipating a Messiah. But God's ways were not their ways. And the entire event was so surprising that most didn't even recognize it when it happened. And I encourage you at this point to get out your sermon outline. There's an outline in your bulletin, and just follow along as we study this story together. Now, Isaiah 55, 8 through 9 says this: "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your way. Either are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." And with this passage from Isaiah as our backdrop, this is kind of the backdrop of our Christmas story. Let's try to examine the birth of Jesus with a fresh mind, and maybe we can gain some insight into how God still works in our lives today. And we're going to look at 3 surprises from this angle. Now, here's surprise number 1. The timing of Jesus' birth was unexpected. The timing of Jesus' birth was unexpected. Now, how do you handle unexpected timing in your life? In Luke chapter 2, verse 1, it says this: "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world." Now, if we were in charge, I doubt any of us would have chosen the time of Caesar Augustus. If the choice were up to the Israelites, the ancient Israelites during this time, they might have chosen the time of King David. You see, because when David was king, the Jews were powerful. You remember some of those stories. They had momentum. The Israelites had wealth. They had influence. They had opportunity. I mean, wouldn't it seem natural that after David died, for the Messiah then to be his successor? The groundwork was already laid. Now, if the GI generation, also commonly referred to as the greatest generation, if they were choosing, perhaps they would have chosen just after World War II. At the end of the largest and the deadliest war in history, world history. An estimated 85 million people were killed, plus millions more wounded and injured. The world was starving for peace, just starving for peace. Who better to enter the world at that time than the Prince of Peace? Now, maybe the baby boomers, I know we have a big representation of baby boomers, but maybe given all the things that have happened in your life, maybe the baby boomers generation would have selected a time maybe right after Watergate. Our nation, our world were hungry for leadership, communication, satellites, space, they were all up there. Modernization was rapidly happening, rapidly taking place, and it would have been a perfect time for the Messiah to come and for that good news to spread to the world. You see, if we could go on and on about each generation, and they probably would look back in history and choose a different time frame, but if people called the shots rather than God, if we were in charge, we probably would have chosen a time based on our wisdom, wouldn't we? But our ways are not God's ways. You see, his timing's perfect. 300 years before Caesar, Alexander the Great had established Greek as the universal language in the Roman Empire. When Jesus was born, it was one of the rare times when the people of the world could communicate with each other. They were all speaking that same language. After Alexander the Great, Rome conquered the world. It was no picnic for the Jews under Roman oppression, but Rome made it possible for worldwide travel. Good roads were built. Perhaps that's part of the reason. Good roads were built. Rome had established peace through military force. It was safer to travel. Missionary travel would be easier. It would be safer. People could go great distances to carry the message of Jesus. Perhaps that's part of the reason why Galatians 4:4 says, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son." You see, it wasn't when man expected it, but all of these events were perfectly synchronized by God. God picked out the time in history, and it was the best time. There was no time like it. But there was one problem, though, in the timing that had to be worked out. There was a detail, one last minute detail. The prophet Micah in 5:2 promised the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth. That's 80 miles away. In a day where they walked everywhere they went, that was a long distance to travel. Mary was about to give birth, but God even arranged that. You see, Caesar required a census that required Joseph to go register in person in the city of his family's roots. Charles Swindoll wrote this. He said, "Augustus thought he was hot stuff, prancing about the palace, demanding that there be a census. In reality, he was little more than a wisp of lint in the prophetic page, a pawn in the hand of the commander of Operation Arrival." Mary and Joseph, at just the right time, had to take a trip to Bethlehem. Now, you women who've had babies, how would you like to take a 4-day hike about that time? Now, surprise number 2. The place of Jesus' birth was unusual. The place of Jesus' birth was unusual. A Roman citizen would have chosen the powerful city of Rome. If a Roman citizen was choosing, I'm sure they would have chosen Rome, the greatest city in all the world. A Greek would have chosen Athens, one of the most intellectual cities in the world. An Egyptian would have probably chosen Alexandria, one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world. And still an Israelite probably would have chosen their capital of Jerusalem. After all, that's where the temple was. Perhaps the Savior could maybe finally restore Jerusalem to its old grandeur and religious importance. But God's choice was this little village in Bethlehem. Today, Bethlehem has a population of about 25,000 people. In Jesus' time, it was 8,233% smaller than it is today. A measly 300 people lived there during Jesus' time. But it was the perfect place to house the birth of Jesus. In Money Magazine, about 20 years ago, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was ranked dead last in a survey of places to live, and over 300, number 300, primarily because of economic reasons. It's a very poor city. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, it was ranked 300. If it was ranked 300, I'd hate to think where Bethlehem of Judea would be ranked among the favorable cities in all the Roman Empire at that time. See, if we were going to select a city for the Messiah to be born in, we probably would have selected one of the greats, not one of the least. Can't you picture the shepherds kind of talking outside of Bethlehem? They're in the fields, it's the stars, they're out there and they're just complaining about what a dead village it was. Nothing really important happens around this time. Nothing really important happens around this area. But not only was Jesus born in Bethlehem, he was born in a stable, an even lesser known place within the city of Bethlehem. And Luke chapter 2, verse 6, it says, she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. I bet Joseph, picture being Joseph for just a moment. I bet he was in near panic mode when he couldn't find a place to stay. And so out of desperation, he found a barn. I wonder if Joseph even questioned God at that point and said, God, this is your son. This is your son, and this is the best you can do. How do I make sure my wife is comfortable? How do I make sure that we're going to be safe? We don't even have four walls around us. You've called us to this, God. If you're the God of the universe, can't you at least find us a room, a suitable room for this to happen? But just as nobody saw Joseph and Mary and thought they'd be perfect parents for the Savior, nobody walked by the manger that day. Nobody walked by that stable and said, this would make a great place for a baby to be born, especially a king. Nobody did that. We would never have selected a stable. Never. But even that shows the plan of God. When the innkeeper turned Joseph and Mary away, it revealed the plan of God. Mary could give birth in the quietness of a stable. The hotels in that day were not quiet, private rooms. They were more like rowdy bunkhouses where people were just jammed together. They crammed as many people as they could in there. Naufel Staton wrote, he says, inns in those days were wild and noisy places. Public bazaars, the butchering of animals, the marketing of wine, drinking, and the noise of reveling through the night were commonplace. God didn't want his son to be born among the leering eyes of the curious, so he took Mary and Joseph to a quiet stable instead. I heard about a little boy who was just bitterly disappointed. This little kid, he was so disappointed because he didn't get the part of Joseph in the Christmas pageant. And he was given this minor role as the innkeeper. And he pouted about that at every rehearsal. He just griped and he complained, and every rehearsal he just made known that he was just not happy, he was not pleased, and he vowed that he was going to get even. One day, finally the night came for the play, and Mary and Joseph knocked on the door to the inn, and the innkeeper was ready with a plan. He cracked open the door and he scowled at them. And Joseph said, "Is there any room in the inn? We need a place to sleep." Well, the innkeeper had planned out, this kid had planned out what he was going to say. And to everybody's surprise, he flew open that door and he said, "Yeah, there's plenty of room. Come on in. I'll give you the best room that I have." And little Joseph stood there stunned for just a moment at this. And he said, "Wait right here, Mary." And he stepped past the innkeeper. He looked around the room and he shook his head and he said, no wife of mine is going to stay in a place like this. Come on, Mary, let's go to the barn." The plot was back on course. Back on course. A hotel in that day was no place for a baby to be born, especially a baby that would be the King of Kings. So you see, it can really It really was a silent night. It was a holy night. All was calm. All was bright. Actually, the Son of God being born in a barn was a demonstration of God's strength. We want the best doctor. We want the most sanitary hospital. We want the finest delivery room. Why? Because we know we're weak. We know there are things out of our control, and so we want the best environment, the safest environment, the most comfortable environment that we can have. We want to make sure that everything is provided for. The baby lives, but God didn't need any of that. He didn't need it. He's in charge. He's the author of life. He's the great physician. If anything were to go wrong, the fact that his son was born in a barn shows that his ways are not our ways. 1 Corinthians 1:27 says, he chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. That's a great message for us to remember this time of year. Now, surprise number 3. The birth of Jesus was uneventful. The birth of Jesus was uneventful. Luke 2:6 says this, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth. Now let me read that one more time. The time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth. What a vanilla statement, right? This is all so ordinary. That same wording could be used of any baby. The time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth. It doesn't really communicate much. It doesn't really make it sound very special. Did you know that you share the same birthday with about 20.8 million other people? Yeah, you thought you were really special, but you really are really not that special. We're not that exceptional. We're not that unique. You share the same birthday with over 20 million people, almost 21 million people. The time came for you to be born, and your mama gave birth. That's it, right? Had we been in charge, though, there would have been a lot of fanfare, wouldn't there? I mean, today when a royal baby, we don't have royals here in America, but think of the royals over in England. When the baby is born, it's front page. It's like this big deal. Everybody's watching. Everyone's taking snapshots and pictures. When a movie star is born, a movie star has a child. It's all over. The paparazzi's chasing them all over the place to try to get these pictures. Max Lucado wrote of Jesus, he looks like anything but a king. His face is prunish and red. His cry, though strong and healthy, is still the helpless, piercing cry of a baby. And he is absolutely dependent on Mary for his well-being, majesty in the midst of the mundane, holiness in the filth of sheep manure and sweat, divinity entering the world on the floor of a stable through the womb of a teenager and in the presence of a carpenter. Meanwhile, the city hums. The merchants are unaware that God has visited their planet. The innkeeper would never believe that he had just sent God into the cold. And the people would scoff at anyone who told them the Messiah lay in the arms of a teenager on the outskirts of their village. They were all too busy to consider the possibility. Those who missed His Majesty's arrival that night missed it not because of evil or malice. No, they missed it because they simply weren't looking. He finishes, he says, little has changed in the last 2,000 years, has it? Now there's one big lesson for us to take home in this uneventful birth. One big lesson. God usually does dramatic things in undramatic ways. And if we're not alert, we miss it. God usually does dramatic things in undramatic ways. And if we are not alert, we miss it. An ordinary child an ordinary place, an ordinary way, but the most important event in history. We miss a lot of God working in our lives because we look for the spectacular, we look for the dramatic. Talk show hosts, think of radio show hosts, even sitcoms, TV shows, news specials. They try to get the most dramatic guests, don't they? They look for the dramatic, some big star, dramatic, over-the-top personality, maybe some kind of neo-Nazi transvestite who's going to conduct a seance for some kindergarten kids or something crazy like that. And everybody watches, right? Everybody tunes in. Like, what is it? This doesn't make any sense. And they want to tune into this. Why? Because we love the dramatic, don't we? We love the dramatic. We love a good story. We love something out of the ordinary. If we were in charge, we probably would have done something dramatic. We'd get attention. We do it dramatically, but God usually does dramatic things in undramatic ways, and we miss it if we are not careful. People sometimes pray for financial help, but they're disappointed if a $1,000 bill doesn't show up in the mail the next day with the return address from heaven. There was a little boy who wrote a letter to God, and he was asking God for $20. And at the post office, the postal worker saw this little postcard and the one who handled the mail, and he didn't know what to do, but he felt sorry for this little boy. And so he and his coworker, they put some money together, and they sent that little boy back $10. Well, 2 weeks later, the postal clerk received another letter to God. And it read, "Dear God, thank you so much for the $10, but the next time I ask for money, send it direct. The last time you sent it through the post office, and they took $10 of it." Young people pray for God to show them the right choice in a marriage partner. And then they're disappointed because there's no audible voice in their life saying, this is the one, this is the one. Sometimes we pray for a sign. Have you ever prayed for a sign? God, I got this big choice. I got this big decision. I got something coming up. God, I don't know what to do. Can you send me just a sign? But sometimes the sign is in the details that you're considering. It's the history of answered prayers when you look back. Maybe it's the lack of strong clarity in the decision-making process. Sometimes the sign is different from the dramatic. You see, in whatever it is in life, we can miss the right thing, the best thing, the God thing if we're not careful. Now, the resurrection was the most dramatic miracle of the New Testament. Fred Craddock said if we were programming the resurrection of Jesus, we would make it more dramatic. Jesus arose from the dead, and he just went to 12 disciples in the upper room. If we were in charge, we wouldn't have him go to the 12 disciples. We would have him go up to the Supreme Court, that 70-member Sanhedrin that had convicted him in the first place, and have Jesus say, "How you doing, fellas? Any trials lately you'd like to recant?" Or we'd have Jesus go to Pontius Pilate and say, "How you doing? Have any advice from your wife that you'd like to talk over with me?" Remember the Pharisees at one point, they said something to Jesus. They said, if you're really the Son of God, then perform some supernatural sign in the sky. Move the moon. Let's have a meteor shower. Let's do something big. But Jesus said, no, there's not going to be anything dramatic. There's only one sign, the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was in the belly of the fish, I'm going to be in the heart of earth. I'm going to be raised from the dead. And if you can believe that by faith, if you can't believe that by faith, then I can't give you any other sign. In 1566, Flemish Renaissance artist Peter Bruegel painted the census. And there is in this picture, there's a great crowd of people. There's a long line waiting to be registered. There are shops, milling crowds, the normal commerce of small towns and people out and about. And when you first see it, you kind of think that it's just a painting of a crowd. If you were just looking at it and you didn't know what it was about, just the painting of a crowd, until you look in the lower part of the painting to the right of center, and then you notice there's a man pulling a donkey. And on the donkey is a pregnant woman. The man is Joseph. The woman is Mary. Easy to miss. you have to actually look hard because their part seems so insignificant and so unimportant in relationship to what is going on in the painting. You know, God often raises up people from unimpressive backgrounds to do his will. In October 28, 2002, the issue of U.S. News and World Report carried a feature article called Ike's Dark Days, How an Unlikely Leader Taught an Unprepared Army to Fight. General Dwight Eisenhower, the man who became the Allied commander, who led the D-Day invasion of Normandy and actually became president afterwards, had a fully unimpressive beginning. He was the third son of a failed Midwestern merchant turned creamery worker. Ike chose a military career because West Point provided a free education. He graduated in the middle of his class. He stalled at the middle rank of major for 16 years. In spite of that, he was chosen to lead the English-American invasion of North Africa. That was initially a failure. The Americans were driven back 85 miles in 1 week with 6,000 casualties. They were utterly humiliated. Those were dark days in Ike's life. But he studied his mistakes and he learned, and he went from being a lieutenant colonel to a 4-star general in 6 years who had never commanded even a platoon in combat prior to 1942. And he went on to lead the Allied forces in defeat of Nazism. Even George Patton, recognizing all of this, said he thought the first 2 initials of Dwight's name stood for divine destiny. You know, on our best days, on pay raise days, on wedding days, on anniversary days, on birthdays, on award days, you know, we're tempted sometimes to look in the mirror. And we're tempted to think, look at me, well accomplished, well dressed, well off. And those are days that we often pat ourselves on the shoulder. On our humble days, though, we look in the mirror and we think, where did I go wrong? How did I get here? How do I fit? But it's on our worst days, our humble days, our modest days, that we are open to actually receiving a tap on the shoulder. A surprise plan of God to use our humble circumstance to bring about the glory of God. Don't miss that opportunity. It just might lead to a surprise this Christmas. Let's pray.